Our speaker today is Claudio Segre, who has written extensively on the Holocaust in Italy, on Italian fascist anti-Semitism, and on the camp survivor Primo Levi, an Italian. In addition to his various scholarly articles, essays, and book reviews, he's had op-ed pieces on topics, as we've mentioned, in such publications as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and the Jerusalem Post. Recently, from the UC Press in Berkeley, has come his prize-winning biography on Italo Balbo, A Fascist Life, which is a study of the Italian fascist politician and aviator. It's available in paperback if you're interested. This September 1995, Viking Press will publish a memoir about other Emilio Segre, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, and the book is to be entitled Atoms, Bombs, and Eskimo Kisses, to pique your interest. Mr. Segre is currently working on a study of Giulio Douhet, an Italian pioneering strategist of air power. Mr. Segre is a native of Palermo, Italy, and he grew up in Los Alamos, New Mexico, and Berkeley, California. Before earning his PhD in history at UC Berkeley, he was with United Press International in Los Angeles and with the Wall Street Journal in San Francisco. He has been the recipient of many scholarly awards, and this includes a visiting fellowship at the National Air and Space Museum. For the last 25 years, he has been a professor of modern European history at the University of Texas at Austin, and this past year he's been a visiting professor of history in the fall semester at UC Berkeley, in the winter, or fall quarter, pardon me.
And I do very much want to thank my good friend Peter Molini, the chairman of the history department, Phil Baird, and those many of you involved in the Holocaust Studies Center here for inviting me to talk about one of my certainly most favorite subjects. Not favorite because it's fun, but I think favorite because it is so terribly important. I'm sorry it's a spring day, a happy day, but I like to think Holocaust. What evidence do we have to substantiate our knowledge of this historical tragedy? Well, that's my theme for today. It's a biggie, a real biggie, as I often tell my students, because it raises not just issues about the Holocaust, but also some of the most fundamental questions that any historian has to face. What is historical knowledge, and how do we acquire it? So I want to do three things this afternoon. First of all, there's the problem of history. Now, Voltaire said, history is a pack of tricks that we play on the dead. And Henry Ford informed us, and who are we to question Henry Ford? Henry Ford informed us that history is bunk. What if both Voltaire and Ford were right? How do we know what we know in history? Second, I want to review with you the evidence for the Holocaust. As you'll see, the amount is overwhelming. Yet, even if we have this platform, how do we interpret it? How do we give it meaning? What do we mean by meaning? That's a very important question also. And finally, I want to examine a case study. I want to discuss with you the work of one famous Holocaust witness, a man who provided first-hand evidence of the Holocaust, and then struggled for the rest of his life to give that evidence meaning. I'm referring to the Italian writer and Holocaust survivor and witness, Primo Levi. Provided so many liters per day per person. Those are all facts that we know, or we can find out from the evidence that we have. We have no shortage of these kinds of facts about the Holocaust. We don't always know all we want to know about a specific topic, perhaps. But we have an overwhelming amount of material, and new evidence is constantly being discovered. Now, I want to point out about the evidence. I want to point out its enormous variety and its sources. First of all, the variety of evidence. And let me list some. Documents, the bread and butter for historians, old-fashioned historians like me. You always like to see a document. There are tons of them. There are Nazi records, the records of the perpetrators. There are train schedules, camp registers and books, business records, architectural drawings. For example, just to give you one example on the architectural drawings, which to you may seem kind of strange, but it's a very valuable source. The Dutch-Canadian historian Robert Jan van Pelt, for example, has been working on the architectural drawings for Auschwitz. He found them in a Moscow archive, and with that he also found correspondence, business correspondence with the architects who built the camp. He found receipts from those who built the crematoria. He found invoices and so on. And of course, what he can do by comparing the different architectural plans is he can get a very clear idea and unedited version. We have memoirs of survivors like Primo Levi. I'll be talking about him shortly. So, diaries of the victims. We have Jewish records, records of the Jewish communities, Yizkor books, diaries of the Łódź ghetto, and so on. We have records of the bystanders. We have, for example, State Department records. We have their intelligence sources, wartime intelligence records, which show very clearly how much was known about the camps of the Nazi programs at the time. Secondly, we have photographic evidence, not just those of the Allies when they first came upon the camps. For example, some of you may have seen recently a documentary called Memory of the Camps. This was something that was done by the British cameraman. It was housed for years in the Imperial War Museum. And it has a very dry, very low-key, absolutely devastating narrative by concentration camp museums, the artifacts ranging from the hair, the spectacles, the gold fillings, millions of shoes taken from the victims, tattered uniforms, prison badges, artwork. Remember that the Holocaust Museum in Washington has a railroad car. Some people have preserved things like the scrip from the Theresienstadt camp. The scrip was the money that was being used locally. The musical programs of the camps themselves. These, of course, are sometimes scanty, in part because the Nazis tried to destroy the evidence as they retreated and abandoned it. Finally, we have oral testimony. We have archives at Yale, for example. That's a famous one. Recordings of survivors. We have archives at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, and many, many other museums. I'm just dropping these particular names, but there are many, many others. General Eisenhower insisted, when he first came upon these camps, that photographs be taken because he wanted to be sure that people would never question the reality of what was found. So we have General Eisenhower on the one hand, and on the other hand we have the films of the Nazis themselves, those famous For the Record movies. Nor have we exhausted the sources. With the fall of the Berlin Wall, with the dissolution of East Germany, the collapse of some kind of meaning, you begin to make judgments. What kind of camp is that where people aren't given enough water? What kind of living hell did that turn out to be? I see already you're starting to sit up and take note. We've given that fact meaning. It's telling us the things we want to know about the conditions of the camp, about the attitudes and policies of those responsible for the camps. So knowing something in an historical sense is more than simply having this Holocaust Studies Center here indicates. Holocaust studies are accepted as a full-fledged and important field of study. Major universities often have their own specialists in the field. Now, secondly, in discussing interpretation, each generation asks different questions of the material. Interpretations, emphases change through time. Interpretations may change as new evidence becomes available. Just give you another. Hilberg, in his Destruction of the European Jews, Hilberg was busy basically studying the bureaucracies, the bureaucratic machinery for destruction. That was his great contribution. Now, another historian, Chris Browning, has done a much more specific work, done many things, but his latest book has been a much more specific work, a brilliant investigation of one particular unit, one particular annihilation unit of an Einsatz group, an execution unit. Who were the people who belonged in it? How did they work together? Why were they doing these horrible things? How could they continue to do these horrible things? So, a kind of micro-study. Another example of changing interpretations would be the long-standing debate between the intentionalists and the functionalists in explaining the origins of Nazi Holocaust policies. Now, the argument centers around whether Nazi Holocaust policies and procedures were became legal exclusions, then deportations, then finally, under the particular circumstances of war, they decided on physical extermination. Now, there's evidence for both sides, both for the intentionalists and the functionalists. That's part of scholarly debate. The important point here is that no matter which side you're on, there's no room for debate here. There's no dispute among serious scholars about whether the Holocaust happened. What scholars are trying to better to understand in the process, moral and ethical questions that historians aren't always accustomed to addressing directly. With the Holocaust, we feel that we are in the presence of some fundamental moral force. We are staring at evil. And let me just give you an example of that. I went to a very memorable conference outside of Texas, Salado, Texas, about an hour north of Austin, where there was a conference dedicated simply to the topic evil. And they invited all sorts of people. Maya Angelou was there, and there were theologians, and Barbara Jordan was there, and all sorts of people, academics and so on. Now, nobody knew what evil was, in the sense that nobody could define it. Nobody could give a really dictionary definition, because there would, being in with a bunch of high-powered intellects and scholars and so on, everybody could find some way of arguing that's not a good definition. Ask ourselves, what happened to God that he would allow such unspeakable acts? These are, of course, more questions for theologians than for historians, and yet we don't have to be specialists. We certainly don't have to have a degree in divinity to sense the presence of these questions, the problem of meaning at that level. How do we deal with them? That, too, is part of the question in asking, how do we know what we know? Well, these are daunting problems. Rather than addressing them directly myself, I thought it might be useful to deal with them today by example. Perhaps we could study the particular case of someone who was particularly well equipped as a survivor and a witness to the Holocaust to grapple with these issues. Now, for my case study, as I've told you, I've chosen one of the most famous of the Holocaust memoirists and witnesses, Primo Levi. Primo Levi, L-E-V-I. His dates are 1919 to 1987. Now, you may remember his story. As a young man of 25, when he was captured by the Italian fascists in December 1943, he was shipped off to Auschwitz, where he spent about 11 months before he was liberated. After the war, he went back to his native Turin, where he worked as a chemist in a paint factory, and he embarked on his career as a writer. His most famous works are his memoirs that relate to his experiences during the Holocaust. And the titles are, the most famous one is Survival in Auschwitz. Survival in Auschwitz. That's the English version. I much prefer the original title, the Italian one, Se questo è un uomo, if this is a man. Another famous one he did was called The Truce, or The Reawakening. And finally, the other great memoir he did was called The Periodic Table. The Periodic Table. But he's well known for his collections of essays about the Holocaust and his poetry, all with Holocaust themes. Now, why is Primo Levi a good case study? Well, first of all, he was there. He spent 11 months in Auschwitz. He experienced the facts firsthand. Secondly, it's instructive to study him because he was an unusually skilled and talented interpreter of these facts. He was not simply a survivor. he was quite consciously and quite deliberately a witness. In this case, I'm using witness and temporal vision of that historical epoch or movement that we call the Holocaust. All too often, when we speak of the Holocaust, we're accustomed to a fairly restricted geographical view. It's quite natural. I really thank you very much for bringing the map here. When we think of the Holocaust, by and large, we think of Germany, Poland, Russia. We're thinking mostly about this area. Okay? But what Primo Levi does, of course, the chronological period, that's really one of his major contributions. Secondly, Levi's example has much to tell us about the process of interpreting the Holocaust, about giving meaning to those facts that we've collected. Now, Levi often knew, of course, what the facts were firsthand. That didn't make it any easier for him, as I'm going to illustrate. It didn't make it any easier for him to understand what those facts meant, how the Holocaust came about, or what its ultimate significance. Well, let me deal with the first issue, how he broadens our geographical and temporal views of the Holocaust. First of all, he does provide a splendid insight into Holocaust, what we could call the Holocaust on the periphery. The Italian Jewish community under fascism, his community. Through his memoirs, especially through the periodic table, we come to understand, we glimpse the story of the Italian Jews. We come to understand their attitudes as Jews. We comprehend how and why, as with so many other Jewish communities, they failed to anticipate the catastrophe that awaited them. So let me give you some of the facts, just as Primo Levi gives us the facts in many ways through his memoirs. Remember how small the Italian Jewish community was? About 40,000. About 0.1% of the population. Compared to the 3.1 million Jews, nearly 10% of the total population that lived in Poland, and the 2.5 million who lived in USSR. So you can understand, why the focus is naturally on Eastern Europe. Now, by and large, Italian Jews were well-educated, highly secularized, assimilated into the Italian middle class. By the end of the 19th century, Jews had reached high positions in society. In politics, they served as finance ministers. In the military, Italy's first Jewish general served as an instructor to the future Italian king. And no less than 50 Jewish generals served in the Italian army during World War I. That tells you something about the nature of Italian society and of how easily the Jews assimilated into that particular world. In that particular climate, most Italian Jews, like Levi, felt that they were Italians first. Levi's family background mirrored the attitudes of that larger community. His father was an engineer who went to services on Yom Kippur from time to time because it was the polite thing to do. Occasionally he ate ham with the air of saying, "I'm sinning," as he said to Primo Levi, "I'm sinning because the flesh is weak, but don't you do it." Levi's mother was even more secular, though she too observed various rituals, such as buying matzahs for Pesach. She arranged annual seders for the grandparents, and so on. Levi did it. He completed his bar mitzvah, and for a couple of years he was even sort of very religious, but always ruthlessly honest with himself. He also remembered that he had a special reason for being so religious. He thought if he was very good, that he would get a bicycle, that God would give him a bicycle. Now, ironically, what gave the Italian Jews then their sense of being apart were the fascist racial laws of 1938. Remember how these racial laws came about? Nazis came to power. January of 1933, Hitler is in power. Almost immediately, anti-Semitic legislation. Almost immediately, discrimination begins. Mussolini came to power in 1922. No anti-Semitic legislation until very late in the regime, 1938. So what the racial laws promulgated then, what at first had been simply what Primo Levi called, and I'm quoting him, a cheerful little anomaly that he was Jewish. Between him and his Christian friends turned out to be a source of discomfort on both sides once those racial laws were passed in Italy. While no one, neither professor nor student, directed any, these are Levi's words, any hostile word or gesture toward him, unquote. He felt that they were keeping their distance, and he responded in kind, 70, and the kind of 19th century liberalism, the stress on the individual, the stress on democratic government, the stress on parliaments, free trade, property rights, that kind of liberalism, that was really what motivated him. That kind of liberalism was what motivated him much more than any kind of religious motivation. So how and why then did Levi and his contemporaries, because many of his, said this man, Nello Rosselli, I call myself a Jew because the monotheistic conscience is indestructible in me, because every even disguised form of idolatry repels me, because I regard with Jewish serenity the mystery of beyond the tomb, because I love all men as in Israel it was commanded, and I have therefore that social conception which it seems to me descends from our best traditions. So a very secular kind of ideology, a very abstract one. Now for Levi himself then, the racial laws and his concentration camp experiences proved absolutely decisive in determining his Jewish identity. As he said, without them, I'd probably no longer be a Jew except for my last name, unquote. The dual experience, he said, stamped me in the way that you stamp a steel plate. At this point, he said, at this point, I'm a Jew. They've sewn the Star of David on me, on us, he said, as on almost all Italians, alienating us and making us superficial, passive, cynical. That is, what he's saying is basically he opted out of politics. There wasn't much he could do, so I'm out. In another passage, Levi describes a typical young Italian of his generation. Quote, he talked about fascism and the war with reticence and a sinister gaiety that I had no trouble interpreting. It was the ironic gaiety of a whole generation of Italians, intelligent fascism, too skeptical to oppose it actively, too young to passively accept the tragedy that was taking shape and to despair of the future, unquote. So until halfway through the war, until the German defeat at Stalingrad during the winter of 1942-43, until the collapse of the fascist regime in July of 1943, Levi's attitude was, as he called it, passive, limited to rejection, isolation, avoiding turn to for inspiration, well, the Talmud, to the Italian philosopher, historian Croce, to geometry, to physics, mathematics, and the sciences, in particular, the sciences and mathematics, because they demanded rigorous proof and demonstration. And as disciplines, they were materialist, as opposed to the fascist philosophical belief in idealism. So, as Levi put it, these disciplines, quote, seem to us sources of certainty, unquote. A period of political cynicism and indifference left its mark. He and his friends had no more faith in the Allies than they did in the fascists. And here I'm quoting, the Allies were masters of the sky. Perhaps in the end they would win and fascism would end. But it was their business. They were rich and powerful. They had airplane carriers and the liberators, the Liberator bombers, but not us. They had declared us different we would be, unquote. With the German occupation, he took to the hills in September of 1943, and then he was captured in December. It's significant. At the time of his capture, Levi was still so uncertain about the meaning of the German occupation. Remember what happened? The fascist regime, Italian fascist regime collapsed, and the Italians signed an armistice with the Allies. In the meantime, the Germans simply occupied most of the country. Levi was so uncertain about the meaning of the German occupation, and detail just what happened in the camps, literally how it was. In many ways, these memoirs read like primary sources. In an unforgettable way, they tell us about the facts of camp life, from an inmate's point of view. When he first began to write, he tells us, he had no idea what he was doing. He simply felt a deep need, as many survivors do, a deep need to tell the story. Like many camp survivors, he was terrified. Sociology of the camps into the craft of survival. As a writer, I think he's at his best as a memoirist. He's an artist with the anecdote, with the telling bit of memory. In the literature of the camps, as far as I'm concerned, there's nobody better. What could be more substantial, concrete, than this passage about getting up in the morning? Let me quote this. And just listen to how concrete he is, how he tells you what it was like, how he gives you the details, and how there's a bit of humor in it also. He understands, as any great writer does, he makes you understand, he makes you feel what it was like to be in these camps. Well, this is how things go in the morning. When reveille sounds, and it's still pitch dark, first of all, we put on our shoes. Otherwise, somebody will steal them, and it's an unspeakable tragedy. Then in the dust and crush, we try to make our beds according to regulations. Immediately after that, we rush to the latrines and the washroom, run to get online for bread, and finally dash to the roll call square. We join our work squads and wait for the head count to end and for the sky to grow lighter. One by one in the dark, the ghosts who are our companions approach. Our squad is a good one. We have a certain esprit de corps. There is no clumsy or whining rookies among us. Among us exists a rough friendship. In the morning, it's customary for us to greet one another. How was your night, Mr. President? Did you enjoy your breakfast? But as a witness, Levy is not content with telling us how it was for him alone. He isn't merely dictating his own story. He wants his memoirs to have a much broader, universal kind of significance. He makes it clear that the tragedy of the camps is not just a Jewish one. All the nations of Europe, as indeed they did if you read about Auschwitz. The camp buzzes with a babble of languages. Furthermore, with his allusions to the Bible, to the slavery of the past, to literary classics like Dante, Levy shows both that the catastrophe has its predecessors in the slavery of the past, but at the same time, this event is unique without precedent in history. It's a very important theme for me. He encompasses within human history, but he also shows the uniqueness of the Holocaust. And I think it's this breadth of vision that distinguishes his memoirs from that of other Holocaust writers. Levy's are not merely literature of the Holocaust, they are one of the few examples of genuine Holocaust literature. Now, Levy doesn't just give us the facts about his experiences. His memoirs and essays also reveal his struggles to make sense of it. And that's what really interests us. How did he struggle with those facts? What did he do with them? His career and his works raise the problems of being a survivor and of the difficulties of memory, the difficulties of interpretation. In many ways, as I said before, his career after the liberation was the most difficult and by far, for my money, the most heroic of his life. Levy made light of his career as a resistance fighter and a partisan during the war. Probably so. It was a short time. The resistance began when he returned home and when he dedicated the rest of his life to keeping the memory of the Holocaust alive. As he wrote in his memoir, The Reawakening, the account of his long odyssey back from the camps, his witnessing began at the moment of his liberation. Quote, "We knew that on the thresholds of our homes, for good or ill, a trial awaited us, and we anticipated it with fear. Soon, tomorrow, we should have to give biting through his memoirs, poems, his journalism, his fiction, but he also spoke in public. He was also interviewed. Again, there was a little clip in Professor Molini's documentary today, a little clip of Primo Levi. He spoke in public. He made visits to the campsites. He carried on a lively correspondence with both the persecuted and the persecutors. As a witness, his attitude towards the Holocaust puzzled and sometimes alienated readers, especially those who wanted to see him as a kind of Italian Elie Wiesel. First of all, Levy viewed his Holocaust experiences with a calm equanimity, a calm and an equanimity that offended some readers. Friends and admirers spoke of Levy's, quote, detachment, unquote. That's the first thing that strikes you when you read his memoirs. How could this man write about these things so dispassionately? His natural curiosity, scientific training, remember he was a chemist, led him to perceive the concentration camps as gigantic social experiments, thus perhaps unconsciously mirroring the views of some of his captors. In the preface to Survival in Auschwitz, he noted that the book was intended, quote, to furnish documentation for a quiet study of certain aspects of the human mind, unquote. Yet his calm, his detached tone, his, quote, denatured pseudoscientific requirement, that should be right in there in the curriculum, Night and Fog. Like Levy's work, Alain René's film is low-key, melancholy, detached. Like Levy, Alain René argues that the Holocaust was not something limited to a specific time and space, a series of events that occurred long ago and far away. Like Levy, René sees the potential for evil, for another Holocaust in all of us. Ironically, despite their apparent self-aggrandizement, as best he can, with a wealth of detail and concrete images, he tells us what Auschwitz was like. His perspectives make the Holocaust manageable, give it a human and historical dimension, a tragedy perpetrated by men on other men. Survival in Auschwitz was about Levy's experiences in the lager, but more important, as the volume's original title was, If This Is a Man, what that indicates is what to explain why the events happened and what they meant. In short, the witness has to judge, has to give meaning. Levy filled the first role brilliantly. The second, he resisted and carried out only with great reluctance, as we'll see. He could report. He had a hard time making judgments, finding meaning. As a reporter-observer, he succeeded. The role agreed with his temperament. It agreed with his scientific background. His recipe, I think probably we're asking too much of him. But he was reluctant to take on the issues. He felt that it was, quote, inopportune, not to say importunate, to take on the place of a judge, unquote. He begged his readers not to look for, quote, unquote, messages in his works. He distrusted the prophet and the seer, he said. At best, he wanted to state the facts. He wanted to leave the conclusions to his readers. Yet, in the act of writing his books, in his selections of books. Now, these implicit messages in his memoirs, then, are probably more satisfactory than his explicit one. As a hostile critic noted, Levy's historical explanation of the Holocaust, for example, is surprisingly simplistic, as this critic commented. And I've deliberately repressed her name. I'm so angry with her. She called him, his interpretation was based on, quote, hackneyed social psychology. Heroes, a continuation of their own will? Yes, says Levy. I'd really say so. And why did the Germans accept Hitler? Levy comments. Well, I've read a lot of books, even by famous historians, and I find they've all thrown up their hands at this problem, the problem of consensus, the mass consensus in Germany. All you can say of those who rejected Hitler is that they didn't accept him enthusiastically, unquote. My own perception, he said, was that the camps had to do with madness, a kind of methodical madness. Well, according to Levy, the madness was transmitted by propaganda. Here I'm quoting him. It's the first case in history in which an especially powerful and violent man, a tyrant, found himself in possession of the spectacular weapons of mass communication, unquote. And why did this phenomenon arise in Germany, you ask Levy? Well, he comes perilously close to accepting a kind of devil theory of German history. You know, the Germans were cursed, that sort of stuff. And here I'm quoting him. I had a distinct impression witnessing the rise of Nazism in Germany and experiencing it firsthand, and then reading about it later. The impression of a curse, of something demonic. He spoke of it a moment ago, of the devil as a constant in German culture, being embodied in Hitler, unquote. And again, quote, yes, the devil is a fundamental presence in their upbringing, unquote. But ultimately, Levy, of course, was an intelligent man, and he rejected the notion. He says, quote, any overall judgment on the intrinsic, innate qualities of a people, to me, I mean to be immune to it, even if sometimes I have to make an effort. Well, the limits of Levy's interpretation are obvious. His focus is almost entirely on Germany, about Italy, about Mussolini, about the racial laws. He has virtually nothing to say. In effect, he continues the standard view of Italian fascism as a lightweight regime and of Mussolini as a dictator without the aura and authority of a Stalin or a Hitler or a Churchill. The racial laws were an obscenity, but for the most part, according to Levy, no one in Italy took them seriously. If we look for, again, looking for meaning, if we seek deep moral or theological insights into the Holocaust, Levy really isn't much more satisfactory. As a secular Jew, as a scientist, he had what we might call a tin ear for religion. Moreover, as he told an interviewer, quote, the experience of Auschwitz has been such as to sweep away any remnant of religious education I had had. There is it, and so there cannot be a God, unquote. Well, how are we to explain the limitations of his vision, this vision of a witness? The power of his direct narrative and his implicit judgments, the weakness of his explicit judgments. Well, one factor, as I pointed out above, is his temperamental reluctance to judge. Levy was by nature a modest man. He was very wary of assuming the prophet's mantle. The factor that complicated his vision is his multiplicity of roles. He is at once a scientist, an artist, and a witness. The three viewpoints often conflict with each other, and they help perhaps explain the tensions and the limits of his work. Levy the scientist was always scrupulous to note only what he had personally observed. He wrote about what he knew. His attitudes, as he described them in the periodic table, reflect secular, apolitical formation under fascism. His prose, too, derived from his training as a scientist and served him well. Simple language, concreteness, clarity. The detachment of the scientist or the paint company executive writing his weekly report, whereas these were his most persuasive tools. Quiet reflection, that's his term. Quiet reflection was his best hope of convincing his readers that the Holocaust had been real, not simply some distant event that he didn't. Witnesses, too, have to find out about the big picture. They have to study it. So he studied the material about the Jewish partisans in Poland and Russia, about which he knew nothing, so that he could write a novel, which was called If Not Now, When? Nor was he above embroidering, combining themes and personalities in a way that best made his point. One of his friends said, Primo was above all an artist, but in no way can he be considered an accurate historian. At whose expense had it been? And here I'm quoting him. It is no more than a supposition, indeed the shadow of a suspicion, that each man is his brother's Cain, that each one of us has usurped his neighbor's place and lived in his stead. It is a supposition, but it gnaws at us. It is nestled like a woodworm, unquote. Meanwhile, the potential for a recurrence of the Holocaust haunted him. Quote, with the new generations suggested to him that perhaps he had not done enough. Quoting, for us to speak with the young becomes ever more difficult. We see it as a duty at the same time as risk. The risk of appearing anachronistic, of not being listened to. We must be listened to, above and beyond our personal experiences. We have collectively witnessed a fundamental, unexpected event, fundamental precisely, not foreseen by anyone. It happened. Therefore, it can happen again. That is the core of what we have to say, unquote. Given these enormous psychological pressures as a survivor and a witness, maybe Levy needed to maintain a certain psychological distance from his story, peering over the edge, pondering the evil directly, the millions of lives sacrificed, the potential for a recurrence. Perhaps that was more than he could balance with he had an aged mother, he had a mother-in-law and so on, some physical problems and so on. All of them apparently combined to eventually to precipitate this tragic death. Of all the people in the world, particularly for me, of all the people in the world, for so many Italian Jews, the one thing you wanted to believe in was Primo Levi. He had survived. He had made it through. He had lived. He had done it. And at the end, this is that I have a clear, detached, scientific tone. We are once again reminded of the realities of the Holocaust. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't one of those massacres that occur from time to time in history. It wasn't an unfortunate byproduct of war. As any careful reading of Levi's accounts show us, the Holocaust was a result of a deliberate and systematic policy by the Nazi government and that of their allies to exterminate its enemies, the Jews in particular, but also other ethnic groups and minorities. As I pointed out, the evidence that supports Levi's view is overwhelming, both in its variety and in its sources, from archaeology to oral testimony, and victims, perpetrators, bystanders all attest to the Holocaust's reality. If we are sure that the Holocaust happened, we're not always sure how it happened. We'll always be trying to fathom the Holocaust's contours, much as Primo Levi did. Was it a question of mass psychosis? Were the new tools of mass media enough to explain what? Was it the kinks and twists of German history? How could people allow the horrors of the Holocaust to happen? That question, that last one, leads us to the most difficult one of all. What did the Holocaust mean? And here Primo Levi again is a splendid guide to our perplexities. The meaning of such evil overwhelmed him, perhaps as it overwhelms many of us. There is no Auschwitz, and so there cannot be God, he remarked. How could these things happen? He had no answers. He could reach no satisfying. The best thing he could do, he concluded, was to tell the story. To tell the story as best he knew how, and it was a duty that he had. In the end, like Primo Levi, we too have trouble coming up with the knowledge that we all seek ultimately, some kind of answer to the meaning of the Holocaust. And in the end, much like Primo Levi, perhaps the best we can do is to tell the story as best we can. Tell it over and over from generation to generation, as we are doing right here and right now. Thank you very much. I'm glad to answer questions if there are questions. Yeah, Phil. Yeah.
Curious about
Exciting one. One of the hottest acts in town, one of the biggest shows, one that can really make headlines, is racism. It turns you against your neighbor. So, for my money, this was Mussolini's doing. Did the Italians, it was not inherent, I would argue, in the Italian fascist regime, not inherent as it was in Nazi ideology. With the Nazis, anti-Semitism was right there from the beginning. With the Italians, it wasn't there from the beginning, and one of the reasons then why we didn't take the fascist laws all that seriously is because most other Italians didn't take them seriously either, in the sense that they found them a nuisance. They didn't like them. They couldn't understand why they had to turn against their neighbors with whom they had been living peaceably for centuries, and they didn't want to be seen as being imitators of their their neighbors up north, their allies up north, the Nazis. Were the racial servants jobs? That included university professors, that included me. I mean, I wasn't, but my father was. So the racial laws were enforced. Primo Levi himself felt that that he was being set aside. There were separate schools for Italian Jewish kids and so on. Nevertheless, as in Italy, and this is a cultural thing, as in Italy, you know, you smile and it's nice, and there's always you can always do things with a kind of. There were always exceptions, and the exceptions were in the law. That is, if you could show enough patriotic merits, you know, if your uncle or your husband or your brother had been in the First World War and fought for Italy, then even though you were Jewish, you could be exempt. Also, there were simply cases in which big-time fascists had Jewish girlfriends, Jewish mistresses. And when the laws were passed, there was one named Farinacci. When the laws were passed, people sort of turned to Farinacci and said, yeah, we know all about you and her. When are you going to get rid of her? And Farinacci got very angry. And he said, what do you mean, when am I going to get rid of her? I'm the one who determines who is Jewish around here. So the point here is the laws were enforced and not enforced. There were no roundups. There were no camps. None of that happened until 1943. Collapse of the fascist regime, then the roundups began. Now you can make the argument, the stuff that took away my grandmother, my Italian grandmother, October 16th, 1943, when the Rome ghetto was evacuated, shall we say. Then it was the Germans, but it was with the compliance of some Italians, not all Italians. But there were Italians who collaborated with the Germans, who were enthusiastic, who remained red-hot fascists to the end. So I think that's what Primo Levi is referring to. The nature of the laws, they weren't inherent in the regime. They developed towards the end, and they were not popular. There's no question about that. And I will say, certainly, that many Italians did behave bravely, courageously. They did hide Jews and so on. So there's no question about that, including many members of the church. One of the reasons that my grandfather was because he knew some people in the church. That was a long answer. Yeah.
Could the wording, the song that was sung during the Ethiopian War, Pacheta Negra, be used as an indication that the Italians really don't have any talent inborn for racism? I mean, Pacheta is almost the
Context of it is a soldier's song. And what it says, I think, is, on the one hand, there were racial policies in the colonies. And I would never want to forget that. There were racial policies in the colonies. They were colonial policies, and they're quite different from Nazi anti-Semitism. Two kinds of oh boy, I'm really going to get going on this one. Two different hope for you. We will help you out. Little brown brother, little brown sister. Very different. There is hope for some kind of reconciliation there. The Italians, of course, partook in both of the, I would say, of that colonial racism, probably more than the biological one. The biological one just didn't go over very well. But it doesn't mean that the Italians weren't racist in this imperial, in this sense of colonial racism. One more thing, they meant business as far as we can tell. Architectural plans. The architectural plans for the new colonial capital of Addis Ababa in Ethiopia would have included a totally segregated society. Okay? I do have to add that. Yes?
I was in Asmara during the war, Africa Italiana, and even though there was no direct discrimination, I was with the British Army, and we occupied.
About 1943 in particular. The Americans were already in North Africa, and every Italian in Italy had a cousin in New York, San Francisco, Chicago, and they were waiting for her. And every time, every American battalion that worked in there always had Italian-speaking soldiers. So it was a big part. So, and by 43, they weren't interested in enforcing anything else. Really, not the people in general. Yeah, yeah.
Sir, you made reference to the...
A Catholic country meant that the biological racism wasn't going to go over very well in terms of doctrine and theology. Because what it meant was there's no way you can be saved. As far as the church itself involved in protecting Jews and so on, I think what I would say is I've tried to work up some empathy for the Pope, for Pius XII. It's hard for me to do so. It's a hierarchy, and on the lower levels, there were many, many monsignors and so on, local priests, who did a great deal to help the Jews. And there is also evidence, I don't remember all the details on this, in which Pius XII said certain things, and yet it was clear that he was leaving a lot of room, a lot of latitude for the lower clergy. Now, we'll never know, what he really had in mind. But I would say that the lower great deal, simply in terms of hiding people, in terms of providing humanitarian aid during wartime and so on, are the sorts of things that the Catholic Church has traditionally done. That the Catholics did that. They provided that. I personally, I would like to have. I wish he'd stood up on the ramparts or stood in the balcony in St. Peter's and said, "No, this is evil. I will not accept this." He didn't do it, and I hope I've explained. Yes.
Are you familiar with the book by Dachau?
No.
Okay. There were 2,400 Christian clergymen, mostly Catholic priests, in Dachau. Hitler had hostages, and he played the hostage game, and this is my estimation, you can read the book. We have the book here, it's on display in the library. And
I was thinking of of course you're all students. I was thinking of the one sitting up in the peanut gallery. Okay, I think it's been a long afternoon. It's a spring day outside. Thank you very much.